My name is Nia, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward, smirking. You know, Nia, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's insistence despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and stayed out of trouble. But none of it was ever enough. 2 days after that miserable brunch, the real nightmare began. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and bright, the kind of day that makes you feel invincible. I was standing inside my favorite local coffee shop, waiting to pay for my usual vanilla latte and a blueberry scone. The barista, a cheerful college student named Tyler, smiled as he ran my debit card through the machine. The machine beeped, flashing a bright red error message. Declined. I frowned, assuming it was a simple chip malfunction. I handed him a different card, one tied to my primary checking account, where my software developer salary was deposited directly. Again the machine beeped its harsh, unforgiving red warning. Declined. A line of impatient customers was forming behind me, their heavy sighs adding to my sudden embarrassment. I quickly pulled out a $20 bill, handed it to Tyler, and stepped aside, my heart racing. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. What I saw made the blood drain completely from my face. My primary checking account, which should have held over $50,000, displayed a balance of zero. My savings account was also locked. A glaring red banner across the top of my screen read that my accounts had been frozen due to a primary trust directive. Panic seized my chest. When I was a teenager, my grandparents had set up a family trust. My mother had cleverly linked all our personal accounts to this central family banking umbrella under the guise of financial protection and estate planning. I had been meaning to separate my accounts entirely for years, but had foolishly left the original framework in place. They had weaponized it against me. Before I could even process the sheer illegality of what they had just done, my phone began to vibrate in my hand. The caller ID displayed the name of my brother-in-law, Desmond. Desmond was married to my older sister, Jasmine. He was a slick, manipulative corporate finance director who always wore tailored suits and a condescending smirk. How was the kind of man who measured a person's worth entirely by their net worth and their willingness to submit to his authority. I took a deep breath, steadying my shaking hands, and answered the call. "Hello, Desmond," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. I heard a low, arrogant chuckle on the other end of the line. "Good morning, Nia," Desmond said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "I assume you have checked your bank accounts by now. You know, since you thought it would be cute to disable the family credit accounts and talk to a lawyer about selling the cabin. Actions have consequences, little sister." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. "You froze my personal bank accounts, Desmond. That is my money. I earned every single penny of that through my software company. That is illegal, and you know it." Desmond simply laughed again, a grating sound that made my stomach churn. "Actually, Nia, as the newly appointed head of family finances, I have full executive authority over the trust umbrella. Your mother signed the paperwork yesterday. We did an audit of your lifetime expenses, and we found some glaring discrepancies. You owe this family a massive debt, and we are simply collecting what is rightfully ours." I stepped out of the coffee shop into the brisk morning air, needing space to breathe. A debt. What are you talking about? I have never borrowed a dime from any of you since I left for college. I paid my own way. I built my own career. I do not owe you anything. You are delusional, Desmond. "Oh, but you do," he replied smoothly, slipping into his best corporate negotiation voice. "We calculated the cost of raising you. The food, the clothes, the roof over your head in Fairfield. We also factored in the emotional toll your constant rebellion has taken on your mother Elaine. We have decided that a flat reimbursement fee of $200,000 is fair. You transfer $200,000 back into the primary family trust, and I will graciously unfreeze your accounts. If you refuse, things will get very uncomfortable for you." I stood frozen on the sidewalk, pedestrians rushing past me, oblivious to the extortion happening right in front of them. "You are demanding $200,000 for the cost of raising me. Parents are supposed to raise their children, Desmond. It is not a loan. You cannot retroactively charge a child for existing. It is a family tax, Nia," Desmond countered coldly. "You have always been the selfish one. While your brother DeAndre and your sister Jasmine have been upholding the family legacy, you have been hiding away, hoarding your wealth. If you do not pay the reimbursement by Friday, I will use our family banking connections to call in the mortgage on your condo. You know the bank president plays golf with your father. We will have you foreclosed on and thrown out into the street before the end of the month. Think of it as a hard lesson in loyalty." Loyalty. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. My mind flashed back to the countless times my so-called loyalty had been demanded and abused. I was always the scapegoat, the designated dumping ground for their mistakes. When my older brother DeAndre wrapped his brand new Porsche around a street lamp because he was driving under the influence, my parents forced me to empty my modest college savings account to help pay off the victim to keep it out of the press. When Jasmine's luxury boutique went bankrupt because she spent all the capital on designer bags and trips to Dubai, they came to me. They demanded I take out a personal loan on my software developer salary to save the family face in our elite megachurch community. They paraded around like untouchable royalty every Sunday, singing hymns and shaking hands while I quietly bled myself dry to cover their tracks. They had always treated me like a broken ATM, a machine that existed solely to dispense cash and absorb their toxic failures. And now they thought they could push me back into submission by holding my livelihood hostage. They thought I was still that terrified little girl in the pale blue bedroom, desperate for a crumb of validation from a mother who could only look at me with disdain. But they had miscalculated entirely. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp air clear the panic from my mind. The shock had passed, and in its place, a cold, clinical anger began to take root. I was a software developer. My entire life was built on finding bugs, dismantling broken systems, and writing new flawless code. My family was just a corrupted system, and Desmond had just handed me the administrative access I needed to crash it completely. "Desmond," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that wiped the smirk right off his face. "You can keep the accounts frozen. You can try to call in the favor with the bank president. But let me make one thing perfectly clear to you. I will not give you a single red cent. You and my mother have finally crossed a line you cannot uncross. Enjoy the power trip while it lasts, because by the time I am finished with you, there will be no family legacy left to protect." Before he could utter another arrogant word, I ended the call. I lowered my phone, stared at the dark screen, and squared my shoulders. The war had officially begun today. I returned to my condo, the crisp air doing little to cool the fire in my veins. My sanctuary was a modest unit purchased with clean money from my software contracts. The threat of foreclosure hovered in my mind, a toxic script executing a countdown, but I refused to let Desmond win. I walked into my living room, my eyes catching on the object that did not match my minimalist aesthetic. Resting against the wall was a heavy wooden frame encasing a faded painting of yellow daisies. It was the only item I inherited from my late grandmother Beatrice. She had been a self-made titan, yet when the lawyer handed me this tacky piece, my family howled with laughter. I kept it simply because she loved it. Suddenly, the blare of a horn pierced the quiet. I walked to the window. Parked illegally across my driveway, crushing my manicured flower bed, was a jet-black Maybach. Out stepped my older sister Jasmine. Dressed in head-to-toe Chanel, she marched up my walkway with the terrifying entitlement of a woman who believed the world existed to cater to her whims. Jasmine pounded her fist against my door. I pulled it open, blocking her path. She did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past me, her heavy perfume dominating my clean apartment, and strutted into my kitchen. "Hello to you too, Jasmine," I said, crossing my arms. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this home invasion?" Jasmine reached into her Birkin bag and slammed a pre-written check onto my kitchen island. I glanced down. It was a check made out to me for exactly $5,000. "I am here to do you a favor," Nia, Jasmine sneered. "Desmond told me about your temper tantrum this morning. You are broke, your accounts are frozen, and you are about to lose this pathetic shoebox. Consider this check an act of charity from your loving sister. $5,000. What exactly are you buying, Jasmine?" My silence. "Because $5,000 will not cover the interest on the emotional debt this family owes me." Jasmine let out a sharp laugh. "I do not want your submission, Nia. You have nothing I want, except that." She pointed a manicured finger directly at the dusty daisy painting. "Desmond wanted to throw it in the trash the day the lawyer handed it to you. But I have a better idea. I am buying it from you." "You want to buy Grandma Beatrice's painting?" I asked, genuinely confused. "You spent the entire reading of the will mocking it. Why pay $5,000 for garbage?" "Because it is garbage." Jasmine spat, her lips curling into a wicked smile. "I am restructuring the corporate headquarters next week. I want to take that hideous canvas, rip it out of its frame, and place it on the floor in the main lobby. I want to use it as a literal doormat. Every morning when my executives walk into the building, they can wipe the mud off their shoes on Grandma's precious daisies. It will serve as a permanent reminder to everyone of what failure looks like. A reminder of you, Nia. A reminder of the weak branch of this family that we finally pruned away." The sheer malice in her voice was breathtaking. She had driven here simply to humiliate me and defile the only memory I had of our grandmother. But as I stood there looking at Jasmine's arrogant stance, the developer inside my brain began running a diagnostic check. I looked at her designer clothes, the expensive car idling outside, and the check. The math was broken. I picked up the check by the edge and handed it back to her. "Keep your money, Jasmine. You are going to need it a lot more than I do." Jasmine scoffed, swatting my hand away. "Do not try to play the proud martyr, Nia. You have $0 to your name. Desmond locked you out. Take the money and give me the painting before the bank throws your belongings onto the curb." I did not flinch. Instead, my eyes traveled from her perfectly styled hair down to her handbag. "You love calling yourself a CEO, Jasmine. You love playing the untouchable corporate queen. But your entire life is just a badly compiled program running on corrupted data. I saw the lease paperwork on your desk last month when you forced me to fix your laptop. That Maybach in my driveway, you did not buy it. You leased it under a predatory 22% interest rate because your personal credit score is shredded." Jasmine's smug smile faltered. Her hand tightened around the handle of her bag. "Shut your mouth," she hissed. "You know nothing about my finances." "I know everything about your finances," I countered, backing her against the counter. "I spent years fixing the broken systems you and Desmond left behind. I know you bought that handbag on a corporate credit card that is 30 days past due. I know your cosmetics company has not turned a real profit in 3 quarters. And you are shuffling money from the employee pension fund just to cover your bloated marketing budget. You are standing in my home pretending to be royalty while absolutely drowning in invisible debt." "How dare you!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice pitching upward. "We are the elite of this city. Desmond and I are running an empire." "You are running a Ponzi scheme built on Grandma Beatrice's legacy," I said calmly. "You came here to bully me because tearing me down is the only way you can distract yourself from the massive margin calls coming your way. Your confidence is a hollow shell, Jasmine. You are empty. And I will burn this painting to ashes myself before I ever let you touch it. Get out of my house." Jasmine's face contorted with rage. The polished veneer melted away, revealing the vicious bully beneath. She snatched the check off the counter, ripping it into tiny pieces and throwing them directly into my face. The torn paper fluttered to the floor like toxic snow. "You are a dead woman walking, Nia," she screamed. "Desmond was going to give you until Friday, but I am calling him right now. We are going to destroy your credit score. We are going to blacklist you from every software firm in this state. You think you can stand up to us? We own this city. By the time I am finished with you, you will be begging on your knees for a job cleaning toilets at my company." I remained motionless, watching her throw her tantrum with the cold detachment of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. "You can try," I said softly. "But remember this moment, Jasmine. Remember the day you walked into my home and declared war. Because when the system crashes and the walls come crumbling down around you, I want you to remember exactly who initiated the final sequence." Jasmine let out a furious scream. She yanked the heavy oak door open and slammed it shut behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. I stood still, listening to the aggressive roar of the Maybach engine as she threw the car into reverse, tearing up more of my lawn as she sped away. The silence that fell over my condo was deafening. I took a deep breath, willing my racing heart to slow down. My mind was sharper than it had been in years. I walked back into the living room, my eyes locking onto the painting of the yellow daisies. It rested exactly where I left it. My logical brain began processing the data points of the argument. Desmond freezing my accounts to force submission was standard bullying. But Jasmine driving to my house to offer $5,000 for a thrift store painting she openly despised. That was an anomaly. That was an erratic string of code that did not fit the pattern. Jasmine did not care about humiliating me with a doormat. She wanted this specific painting. She was desperate to get it before I looked closely. Desmond wanted it destroyed. Jasmine wanted to buy it under the guise of an insult. The family that evaluated everything strictly by its monetary worth was suddenly obsessed with a piece of garbage. I knelt on the hardwood floor in front of the heavy wooden frame. I reached out, running my fingertips over the faded canvas and ornate molding. There was no signature on the front, no signs of value. But Grandmother Beatrice was a genius, a woman who never did anything without a reason. She left the million-dollar assets to the greedy wolves, but deliberately ensured this dusty eyesore was handed directly to me. I gently turned the painting around. It was sealed with brittle brown paper. They were not trying to buy a doormat. They were buying a secret. I grabbed a knife, knowing they were terrified. My fingers gripped the handle of the chef's knife tightly. The stainless steel gleamed under the harsh overhead lights of my kitchen. I hovered the sharp tip just millimeters above the brittle brown paper backing of the frame. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to slice it open. I wanted to tear away the decades of dust and uncover whatever truth had driven my sister to pure panic. But my training as a software developer kicked in. You do not recklessly pry open a black box without knowing the underlying architecture. One wrong move with a clumsy kitchen knife could permanently corrupt the data inside. If Grandmother Beatrice had hidden something valuable enough to make Desmond and Jasmine lose their minds, I could not risk destroying it with a jagged blade. I slowly exhaled and set the knife down on the granite counter. I carried the heavy wooden frame into my dining room and laid it flat on the table face down. I spent the entire next day pacing the floors of my condo. My phone buzzed relentlessly with aggressive text messages from Desmond, threatening legal ruin, foreclosure, and complete financial destruction. I ignored every single one. I muted my notifications, drank far too much black coffee, and stared at the brown paper backing of that painting. I researched the frame type, the canvas material, and the history of hidden compartments. The hours blurred together in a haze of caffeine and paranoia. I kept the blinds drawn, half expecting Jasmine to send a corporate security team to kick down my door. By the time the next evening arrived, the silence in my apartment felt heavy and oppressive. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the hardwood floors. I was standing in the kitchen pouring my fourth cup of coffee when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the condo. I froze. The coffee splashed onto the counter. My first instinct was to grab my phone and dial for the police. Jasmine had promised to escalate her threats. I crept quietly toward the front door, my bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. I pressed my eye against the peephole, fully expecting to see Desmond flanked by his aggressive corporate lawyers. Instead, I saw a man who looked entirely out of place in my modern apartment complex. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a distinguished posture and neatly trimmed silver hair. He wore a tailored tweed suit that practically screamed old money, complete with a silk pocket square and a classic wool overcoat. He stood perfectly still, holding a weathered leather briefcase in one hand. He did not look like a threat. He looked like an emissary from a different era. I unfastened the deadbolt and opened the door just a few inches, keeping the security chain engaged. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice guarded. The man offered a polite, deeply respectful nod. "Good evening, Nia," he said. His voice was rich and melodic like a classic radio broadcaster. "My name is Elias. I am an independent art appraiser and a specialist in asset authentication. I understand you have been going through a rather turbulent 48 hours with your family." My eyes narrowed. "Did Desmond send you? Because you can tell him my answer is still no." Elias offered a gentle, reassuring smile. "Desmond has absolutely no idea who I am, nor would he understand my profession if he did. I do not work for your brother-in-law. I work for Beatrice. I was your grandmother's secret proxy." The mention of my grandmother's name made my chest tighten. I unlocked the security chain and opened the door fully. Elias stepped inside, wiping his shoes meticulously on the welcome mat. He carried an air of absolute calm that instantly neutralized the frantic energy in my apartment. He walked into my living room, unbuttoning his overcoat. I did not judge my modest furniture or the stacks of audit files on my desk. His eyes bypassed everything and locked directly onto the dining room table. I saw the ugly daisy painting resting exactly where I had left it. Elias slowly approached the table. He did not look at the garish yellow flowers with the disgust my family had shown. He looked at the heavy wooden frame with a profound sense of reverence. He reached out, letting his hand hover just above the canvas, without actually touching it. "Your grandmother was a brilliant woman, Nia." Elias spoke softly, almost as if he were talking to the painting itself. "She knew exactly how blinded your siblings were by their own greed. She knew they only valued things that shined. They only respected things with a visible price tag. She understood that the safest place to hide a priceless asset was behind a mask of absolute mediocrity. She trusted you to see past the surface. She knew you had the auditor's eye." Elias turned his head slowly and looked directly into my eyes. He asked the pivotal question. "Nia, have you opened the back of that painting yet?" I shook my head. "I almost did. I had a knife to it last night after Jasmine tried to buy it from me. But I stopped. I was afraid I would damage whatever was inside." A look of profound relief washed over Elias's face. "Thank heavens for your restraint," he murmured. "A clumsy cut could have destroyed millions in an instant." Millions. The word hung in the air, shifting the gravity of the room. I watched as Elias lifted his weathered leather briefcase and placed it gently on the edge of the dining table. The brass locks clicked open with a satisfying heavy sound. When he lifted the lid, I felt like I was watching a scene pulled directly from a high-stakes heist movie. The interior of the briefcase was lined with crimson velvet. It did not hold paperwork or standard appraisal forms. It held a meticulously organized array of specialized tools. There were tiny flashlights, magnifying loupes, delicate brushes, and an assortment of stainless steel instruments that looked like surgical equipment. Elias reached into a side pocket and pulled out a pair of pristine white cotton gloves. He pulled them over his hands, adjusting the fabric until it fit seamlessly against his skin. The atmosphere in the room transformed completely. The casual nature of my dining room vanished. We were no longer in a simple condo. We were in a secure laboratory standing on the precipice of a massive revelation. "Let us see what Beatrice left for you," Elias said, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. He selected a tool from the velvet lining. It was a surgical scalpel, the blade so thin and sharp it caught the light like a sliver of ice. He leaned over the table, bringing his face just inches from the back of the painting. He clicked on a small, high-powered pen light and inspected the perimeter of the brittle brown paper backing. "This paper has not been disturbed in decades," he observed, his eyes scanning the edges with laser focus. "Your grandmother used a specific archival adhesive. If we pull it, the paper will shatter and the dust could compromise the inner layer. We have to be surgical." I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest sound would distract him. Elias positioned the scalpel at the top right corner of the frame. With an incredibly steady hand, he pressed the tip of the blade into the microscopic gap between the brown paper and the heavy wood. He pulled the scalpel downward. The sound was distinct and agonizingly slow. It was a crisp, continuous slicing noise, like a sharp blade gliding through thick silk. He scored the right side, then moved to the bottom, rotating his body with the fluid grace of a seasoned professional. My eyes were glued to the blade. The tension was suffocating. Every time the scalpel encountered a thick glob of ancient glue, Elias would pause, adjust his angle by a fraction of a millimeter, and slice through the resistance. He moved to the left side, then finally across the top edge. The perimeter was completely severed. Elias set the scalpel down on a sterile cloth. He took a pair of specialized flat tweezers from his case. He gripped the top edge of the severed brown paper and began to peel it backward. The brittle material crackled and groaned, protesting its removal after decades of silence. Dust motes danced in the beam of his penlight. He rolled the paper down slowly, exposing the rough, wooden backing board beneath it. Once the paper was completely removed and discarded to the side, Elias pointed to the wooden board. "Do you see these small metal brads?" he asked, his voice steady. "They are holding the front canvas in place. But look closely at the depth of the frame. This molding is 3 inches deep. The front canvas only requires half an inch. The math does not add up." I leaned in my developer brain, instantly recognizing the spatial discrepancy. "There is a void," I whispered. "A gap between the front canvas and the back board." "Exactly," Elias confirmed. He retrieved a small specialized pry bar from his velvet kit. He wedged the flat edge under the first metal brad and popped it loose. He moved around the frame, methodically extracting each tiny piece of metal. Ping, ping, ping. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a ticking clock. My pulse hammered in my ears. I thought about Jasmine tearing up her check. I thought about Desmond threatening my home. They were terrified of whatever was sitting on my table. Elias removed the final brad. He placed his white-gloved hands flat against the wooden backing board. He looked at me, giving a silent nod of preparation. Then he lifted the board away. Underneath, the back of the ugly daisy canvas was exposed. Elias reached under the edges of the daisy canvas and carefully lifted it out of the heavy wooden frame. He set the hideous painting of yellow flowers off to the side, discarding the disguise my grandmother had so brilliantly employed. I stared down into the empty wooden frame. My breath caught in my throat. Resting inside the dark, hollow cavity of the frame, protected by decades of shadow and silence, was a second canvas. It was not stretched over wood. It was rolled tightly into a thick cylindrical tube and secured with 2 strips of faded archival tape. The canvas material looked raw, textured, and ancient. Elias reached into the hollow space. He lifted the rolled canvas with the utmost care, cradling it in his gloved hands, as if he were holding a newborn child. He placed it gently onto the clean surface of my dining table. He took his scalpel and carefully sliced through the 2 strips of faded tape. "We are going to unroll it together," Elias instructed softly. "Hold the bottom edge flat against the table. I will guide the top." I nodded, my hands trembling slightly. I pressed my fingertips against the rough bottom edge of the canvas. Elias took the top edge and slowly began to unroll the cylinder. As the canvas unfurled, bright violet colors began to emerge from the darkness. Bold strokes of red, chaotic slashes of black, and vibrant streaks of yellow broke into the light. It was not a painting of flowers or landscapes. It was a raw, aggressive explosion of neo-expressionist art. There were skeletal figures, erratic text, and a chaotic, emotional intensity that practically vibrated off the fabric. Elias flattened the canvas completely. He shined his penlight directly onto the bottom right corner of the painting. He traced a specific symbol painted in harsh black strokes. It was a jagged, 3-pointed crown. My eyes widened as I stared at the masterpiece laid bare on my dining room table. The ugly daisy painting had just been the armor. What lay beneath it was about to change the trajectory of my entire life. Jean-Michel Basquiat. Elias breathed, his voice carrying a weight of absolute certainty. "This is an original, undocumented Basquiat." I stared at the canvas, trying to comprehend what he was saying. Even outside the elite circles of fine art collectors, everyone knew the name. Basquiat was a pioneer of neo-expressionism, a man who took the raw, chaotic energy of street art and forced the pristine, exclusionary gallery world to pay attention. But seeing one sitting on my dining room table, hidden behind a thrift store painting of yellow daisies, defied all logic. How did my grandmother get this? I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I looked at the violent slashes of color. Elias stepped back, keeping a respectful distance from the fabric. Beatrice purchased this directly from Jean-Michel in the early 1980s, long before the world truly recognized his genius. She was just starting to build her cosmetics empire, traveling to New York City to pitch her products to independent boutiques in Lower Manhattan. They crossed paths in a studio downtown. Two brilliant, ambitious black creators trying to break into industries that were structurally designed to keep them out. She bought this piece out of the back of his studio for a few $1,000s. It was a massive sum of money for her at the time, a huge financial risk. But she saw his fire because she carried that exact same fire inside herself. I looked down at the painting, seeing it through a completely different lens. It was not just a valuable asset to be liquidated. It was a testament to my grandmother's vision and her willingness to bet on underdogs. The canvas was alive with frantic electric energy. Harsh blocks of primary colors clashed against stark, jagged black outlines. A central figure, anatomical and exposed like an X-ray, seemed to leap off the fabric, surrounded by crossed-out words and cryptic anatomical symbols. And there, in the bottom right corner, was the unmistakable three-pointed crown, Basquiat's signature motif, elevating his marginalized subjects to absolute royalty. Elias retrieved a jeweler's loupe and a small ultraviolet flashlight from his velvet-lined briefcase. He leaned over the table, bringing his eye inches from the canvas surface. The authentication process requires meticulous attention to detail, he explained, his voice slipping into the analytical rhythm of an expert at work. I need to verify the medium and the specific layering techniques Jean-Michel employed during that specific era. He frequently mixed acrylic oil stick and spray paint, creating a very distinct chemical signature that modern forgers struggle to replicate. I watched in silence as Elias moved the loupe slowly across the canvas. He examined the way the oil stick dragged across the rough texture of the fabric, leaving tiny gaps of unpainted canvas behind. He inspected the areas where words had been painted over and rewritten. Look at the crown, Elias instructed, gesturing for me to step closer. I leaned in, observing the thick black paint. Notice the confident, aggressive strokes. There is no hesitation here. Forgers always hesitate. They try to mimic the chaos, but their lines end up looking calculated, slow, and stiff. This crown was painted with raw, unfiltered emotion. And here, look at the integration of the oil stick with the acrylic base under the ultraviolet light. The aging of the pigments is perfectly consistent with materials manufactured in the early 80s. The canvas itself shows the correct signs of natural oxidation along the unpainted margins. He straightened up, turned off the ultraviolet light, and removed the loupe from his eye. He carefully placed his tools back into his briefcase. He took off his white cotton gloves one by one and laid them flat on the table next to the canvas. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind, Nia, Elias stated firmly. I am willing to stake my entire professional reputation, my career, and my license on this authentication. You are looking at a lost masterpiece. Because it has been hidden away for decades, protected from ultraviolet light, smoke, and environmental damage by that clever daisy disguise, the preservation is immaculate. It is a pristine, undocumented work by one of the most sought-after artists in modern human history. My throat felt incredibly dry. I gripped the edge of the granite counter, grounding myself in the physical reality of my kitchen to keep from spinning out of control. How much is it worth, Elias? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Elias looked at me, his expression grave and entirely serious. He did not hesitate, nor did he sugarcoat the valuation. Given the current market frenzy for Basquiat's undocumented early works, combined with the immaculate condition of the canvas and the compelling provenance of your grandmother's ownership, I conservatively appraise this painting at $35 million. $35 million. The number echoed in my head, loud and deafening, drowning out the ambient hum of the city outside my window. I felt the floor drop away beneath my feet. I had to lock my knees to keep from collapsing. $35 million. Less than 48 hours ago, Desmond had frozen my bank accounts and demanded an extortion fee of $200,000. He had threatened to foreclose on my independently owned home and destroy my life over a fabricated imaginary debt. Jasmine had stood in this exact spot, tossing ripped pieces of a $5,000 check in my face, mocking my livelihood and threatening to turn my grandmother's memory into a doormat. They thought they had won. They thought they had starved me out of the game. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently standing over a clean liquid asset worth more than their entire bloated debt-ridden corporate facade. Grandmother Beatrice had not left me a token of pity to hang on my wall. She had left me a financial nuclear weapon. I felt a fierce, unapologetic smile spread across my face. The sheer power of the asset sitting on my dining table shifted the entire balance of the war. I was no longer the broke, discarded sister fighting for survival against a multi-million-dollar family machine. I was suddenly the wealthiest and most powerful person in the family. "We need to secure this immediately," Elias said, breaking into my racing thoughts. "We cannot leave a $35 million painting sitting on a table in a residential condo. I have arranged for an armored, climate-controlled transport vehicle. It is parked 3 blocks away, waiting for my signal. We will move the canvas to a maximum security vault at my bank tonight. But first, I need to properly dismantle and pack the empty frame to ensure we leave no evidence behind for anyone who might come looking." Elias turned his attention back to the heavy wooden frame that had served as the painting's armor for so many years. He picked up his specialized pry bar and began removing the final structural struts that held the thick backing board in place. He worked quickly but methodically, dismantling the heavy oak sections to ensure the frame could be easily transported and disposed of later. As he wedged the flat edge of the pry bar under the thick bottom section of the frame, I heard a sharp mechanical click. It was not the sound of ancient wood splintering or a rusted nail popping loose. It was the distinct metallic sound of a hidden spring releasing its tension. Elias froze instantly. His eyes darted to mine across the table. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his posture rigid. Before I could answer, the thick bottom section of the wooden frame suddenly shifted. A seamless panel of oak, perfectly camouflaged within the ornate molding, and decades of dust snapped open on a concealed piano hinge. It was a false bottom integrated into the heavy wood with such masterful cabinet-maker precision that Elias had completely missed it during his initial visual inspection. The hidden compartment was narrow, deep, and lined with dark felt to prevent anything inside from rattling. Gravity did the rest of the work. 2 items slid out from the concealed cavity and dropped heavily onto the clean surface of my dining table with a solid thud. The first item was a thick metallic USB flash drive. As a software developer, my eyes zeroed in on it immediately. It was not a standard cheap plastic drive you could buy at an electronics store. It was encased in heavy brushed titanium. It featured a biometric thumbprint scanner and a small digital alphanumeric keypad for password entry along its spine. It looked like a piece of military-grade hardware, specifically designed with hardware-level AES 256-bit encryption to protect incredibly sensitive, highly classified data. The second item was a thick cream-colored envelope. The paper was high-quality, heavy, and textured. The envelope was sealed with dark red wax pressed deeply with the official crest of Grandmother Beatrice's cosmetics empire. Written across the front of the envelope in Beatrice's elegant, unmistakable cursive handwriting were 2 words: "For Nia." I stared at the envelope, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The discovery of the $35 million painting was suddenly eclipsed by the sheer terrifying mystery of what lay on the table before me. My grandmother had orchestrated this entire sequence of events with ruthless precision. She had hidden a fortune behind a hideous painting, knowing my arrogant siblings would reject it without a second thought. She had instructed Elias to find me exactly when I needed him. And she had built a hidden compartment into the frame concealing a high-security data drive and a personal letter addressed specifically to me. Elias stepped back from the table, removing his hands from the frame and giving me space. He gestured respectfully toward the envelope. "I believe that belongs to you, Nia," he said quietly. I reached out with shaking hands and picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavy, carrying the weight of my grandmother's final words and whatever secrets she had taken to the grave. I ran my thumb over the red wax seal, tracing the familiar ridges of the family crest. Beatrice had always been 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Even from the grave, she was still directing the play. I broke the wax seal. The crisp snap of the wax echoed loudly in the silent room. I pulled out several pages of thick stationery covered edge to edge in her flowing handwriting. I unfolded the letter, took a deep breath, and began to read my grandmother's final confession. My dearest Nia, I read aloud, my voice steadying as the familiarity of her sharp, commanding tone washed over me. The heavy parchment paper smelled faintly of her signature lavender perfume, a ghost lingering in my dining room. If you are reading this, it means you possess the patience and the intellect to look past the surface. I always knew you were the only one who inherited my true sight. I paused, glancing up at Elias. He stood perfectly still, his hands folded neatly in front of his tailored tweed suit, giving me the silent space to absorb the monumental weight of the moment. I looked back down at the elegant flowing cursive. For years I sat at the head of the dining table and watched your siblings and your parents parade around in their least designer clothes. I listened to their sanctimonious speeches every Sunday at church, watching them perform their fake piety for the congregation. They thought I was just a blind, fading old woman. They thought their bright smiles and their sycophantic praises hid their rotting, greedy cores. They were wrong. I saw everything. I saw how they treated you, Nia. I saw them use your brilliant mind and your generous spirit as a dumping ground for their own spectacular failures. I watched them bleed your bank accounts to save their manufactured reputations. And I decided it was time to let them choke on their own vanity. A tight, breathless feeling expanded in my chest. Beatrice had known. She had seen every time they belittled me, every time they extorted my salary to cover their tracks. She had seen the truth. Let us begin with your sister and her husband. I continued reading, my pulse pounding a fierce rhythm against my ribs. Jasmine loves to play the brilliant chief executive officer, and Desmond plays the untouchable financial mastermind. They thought they were being incredibly clever, but I built that cosmetics company from a single mixing bowl in a cramped kitchen. I know every ledger, every margin, and every vendor. I knew that for the past 5 years, Desmond and Jasmine have been aggressively cooking the corporate books. They have been siphoning millions of dollars from the employee pension funds, falsifying quarterly revenue reports, and funneling the stolen capital into offshore shell companies to fund their lavish lifestyle. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My auditor's brain immediately began mapping the structural damage. Desmond had just frozen my accounts this morning, acting as the supreme financial authority, while simultaneously embezzling millions behind closed doors. I kept reading, my eyes scanning the devastating lines. Desmond thought his wire transfers were untraceable. He thought his creative accounting was flawless. He is a fool. The company is completely hollowed out. It is a rotting carcass held together by fraudulent tax returns, phantom vendors, and unpaid invoices. They owe tens of millions to the federal government in back taxes alone. The Internal Revenue Service is already circling, and the corporate accounts are absolutely empty. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and moved to the next paragraph. Then there is your brother DeAndre. He always loved to play the king of the castle, strutting around the Buckhead mansion, as if he actually earned the right to walk on marble floors. DeAndre has a sickness, Nia. He has a gambling addiction that goes far beyond weekend trips to Las Vegas. He got involved with underground betting rings. Dangerous people, violent people. When he burned through his trust fund allowance, he panicked. He secretly leveraged the family mansion, taking out toxic high-interest shadow mortgages from illegal lenders to cover his massive debts. He used his position as an heir to secure loans that a legitimate bank would never approve. He owes them $20 million. The mansion is entirely underwater. It belongs to the shadows now. I lowered the letter, for a fraction of a second, my mind spinning. I pictured DeAndre tossing the keys to the $15 million mansion in the air at the lawyer's office, laughing at my expense. He thought he had been handed a kingdom. He had actually been handed a death sentence. You are probably wondering why I let this happen. The letter continued, answering my unspoken question. Why I did not fire Desmond, disinherit Jasmine, and kick DeAndre out into the street. The answer is simple. A clean disinheritance would have only given them grounds to sue my estate. They would have dragged you into a decade-long legal battle, draining your energy and your resources, claiming I was not of sound mind. I needed a permanent solution. I needed a trap they would gladly walk into themselves. I read the next lines with a growing sense of awe at my grandmother's ruthless, calculated brilliance. My last will and testament was not a distribution of wealth, Nia. It was a financial guillotine. I intentionally bequeathed the corporate empire to Jasmine and Desmond. I deliberately bequeathed the Buckhead mansion to DeAndre. I knew their greed would blind them. I knew they would rush to sign the inheritance deeds without conducting a single independent audit. And by signing those deeds, by officially accepting the inheritance, they legally assumed full personal liability for all the catastrophic debt attached to those assets. Elias let out a low, impressed breath. He shook his head slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. She gave them the anchors, he murmured. And they tied the ropes around their own necks. Exactly, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked back at the heavy parchment. They wanted the crown, Nia, Beatrice wrote. So I let them wear it. Desmond and Jasmine are now personally liable for the federal tax fraud and the missing pension funds. DeAndre is now the sole legal debtor to a syndicate of violent loan sharks. The moment the creditors realize the primary trust is empty, your siblings will face total annihilation. They will lose their cars, their clothes, their freedom, and their reputations. They built a house of cards, and I simply removed the table. I stared at the page, the magnitude of her strategy washing over me. Beatrice had weaponized their own arrogance against them. She had let them dig their own graves, and then handed them the shovels to finalize the job. The final page of the letter was written with a softer, more intimate stroke, the harsh angles of her cursive giving way to a gentle flow. But I did not leave the table empty for you. While they were busy looting the corporate shell and mortgaging the bricks, I spent the last 3 years quietly and legally liquidating all of my actual clean assets. The real estate portfolios, the private stock options, the original patents. I converted over $100 million into clean, untraceable liquidity. I hid it all inside an anonymous offshore trust far beyond the reach of American tax liens or family probate courts. I stopped reading. My lungs forgot how to process air. $100 million. I looked at the heavy titanium drive resting on my dining room table, sitting innocently next to a $35 million Basquiat canvas. The sheer scale of the wealth was incomprehensible. I named you as the sole irrevocable executor and sole beneficiary of this offshore trust. The letter commanded. You are the only one with the intelligence, the integrity, and the strength to handle it. The heavy titanium drive sitting on your table holds everything you need. It contains the encrypted access keys and routing numbers to the offshore accounts. It contains the official, legally binding deed of ownership and authentication provenance for the Basquiat canvas. And most importantly, it contains my master ledger. I ran my fingers over the brushed metal of the USB drive, feeling the cold biometric thumbprint scanner. I spent 5 years quietly duplicating Desmond's hard drives, Beatrice revealed. I possess every fake invoice, every illegal wire transfer, and every piece of communication, proving his corporate embezzlement and tax fraud. I mapped the entire network of DeAndre's shadow mortgages. It is a bulletproof forensic dossier. It is the absolute truth backed by irrefutable data. The letter concluded with a final powerful directive, a battle cry passed from one generation to the next. They will come for you, Nia. When the bank accounts freeze and the creditors start calling, they will panic. They will try to tear you down because you are the only one left standing. Do not let them. Do not offer them mercy, because they never offered you any. Blood is just biology. Loyalty is a choice. They chose greed. Use the ledger. Use the art. Build your own empire, and let their rotting kingdom collapse into the dust. I love you, my brilliant girl. Take what is yours. I carefully folded the heavy parchment and set it down next to the titanium drive. The silence in the condo was absolute, broken only by the steady rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I looked up at Elias. The distinguished appraiser was watching me with an expression of quiet respect. She left me everything I whispered, the reality finally anchoring itself in my bones. The money, the art, the proof. Elias nodded, gesturing toward the drive. She gave you the ultimate leverage, Nia. You hold the keys to a fortune, and you hold the evidence of their crimes. You are now the architect of this family's fate. I reached out and picked up the titanium drive. It felt incredibly heavy, a dense block of raw power resting in the palm of my hand. I thought about Desmond freezing my meager checking account this morning, acting like a god over my finances. I thought about Jasmine tearing up her $5,000 check on my floor, vowing to destroy my credit score. They had no idea they were already dead. They were just waiting for the system to process the fatal error. I booted up my secure auditor laptop. It was time to decrypt the ledger. It was time to map the destruction. I plugged the heavy titanium drive into the encrypted port of my primary forensic workstation. My dining room table had quickly transformed from an art appraisal space into a digital war room. Elias stood quietly by the window, keeping a respectful distance while standing guard over the rolled Basquiat canvas. I powered up my secondary and tertiary monitors, bathing the room in the harsh, blue glow of high-definition screens. The titanium drive did not auto-mount like a standard storage device. It required a physical handshake. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner embedded in the brushed metal casing. A tiny LED indicator flashed from red to amber, signaling the first gate was open. Next came the alphanumeric keypad along the spine. Grandmother Beatrice had not explicitly stated the password in her letter, but a brilliant woman who orchestrated a flawless trap would not leave the final key to chance. I thought about the painting. I thought about the artist. I typed in the year. Beatrice purchased the painting, followed by the specific catalog number of the piece, and finally the word crown. The LED indicator flashed green. The drive mounted to my desktop with a soft chime. I initiated my custom forensic parsing software, a proprietary program. I had coded myself to hunt down anomalies in massive corporate data dumps. The software interface launched, ready to ingest whatever Beatrice had compiled. I selected the master directory on the titanium drive and hit execute. The raw data did not just trickle onto my screens, it erupted. Thousands of compressed files, encrypted bank statements, offshore routing numbers, and hidden server logs cascaded across my 3 monitors in a rapid-fire sequence of code. The sheer volume of information was staggering, but Beatrice had organized it with the clinical precision of a master architect. She had categorized the data into 3 distinct, heavily encrypted directories. The first was labeled corporate. The second was labeled real estate. The third, sitting isolated at the bottom of the directory tree, was simply labeled the trust. I dragged the corporate folder into my parsing engine. It was time to look at the cosmetics empire Jasmine and Desmond had been so desperate to steal. My software began compiling the disparate ledgers into a massive interconnected visual web. On my left monitor, the official public-facing books of the cosmetics company, rendered as a neat, orderly column of green revenue streams. On my center monitor, the hidden secondary ledger that Beatrice had painstakingly duplicated from Desmond's hard drive began to overlay the public data. The visual translation of the fraud was breathtaking. Red lines representing illicit wire transfers shot across the screen like arterial bleeding. Desmond had set up a complex labyrinth of shell companies stationed in jurisdictions with extremely loose financial oversight. He was taking legitimate revenue, routing it through these phantom vendors as bogus consulting fees, and funneling the clean cash directly into their personal offshore accounts. He had built an automated pipeline of theft, but that was just the beginning of the structural rot. I ran a cross-reference query against the employee pension fund allocations. The progress bar loaded, and then the screen flashed with a critical error warning in bright yellow. The pension funds were not just mismanaged, they were completely hollowed out. Jasmine had been using the retirement savings of their own employees to artificially inflate the marketing budget, masking the company's plummeting sales figures with aggressive, flashy ad campaigns. She was burning the future to paint a pretty picture of the present. I initiated a final diagnostic scan, compiling the total tax liability created by 5 years of aggressive, undocumented embezzlement. The algorithm crunched the numbers, factoring in compound interest penalties and federal evasion fines. When the final sum rendered on the screen in stark bold text, I actually felt a chill radiate through my arms. $40,000. The cosmetics empire owed exactly $40 million in back taxes to the Internal Revenue Service. This was not a debt that could be negotiated over a round of golf or settled through creative corporate bankruptcy. This was systemic, provable federal tax fraud. The IRS algorithms would inevitably flag the massive discrepancies within the next fiscal quarter. When they did, they would issue immediate, devastating federal liens against the company and its primary operators. Jasmine and Desmond had spent the entire week celebrating their hostile takeover of the family business. They had aggressively bullied me, frozen my meager accounts, and laughed in my face. They thought they had secured a dynasty. In reality, by legally accepting the inheritance and signing those corporate transfer deeds, they had legally assumed absolute personal and criminal liability for the entire $40 million deficit. Beatrice had handed them a ticking time bomb, and they had greedily chained it to their own chests. I closed the corporate ledger. The digital roadmap of their destruction was complete. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart, and dragged the second folder labeled Real Estate into the parsing engine. It was time to look at DeAndre. My brother had always carried himself like untouchable royalty. He inherited the massive Buckhead mansion, a sprawling $15 million estate of marble and glass. He had spent the reading of the will gloating, already planning lavish parties, and mocking my complete lack of real estate assets. He loved the illusion of absolute power. The parsing engine ingested the data. A three-dimensional visual map of the mansion's financial structure rendered on my right monitor. To the public eye, the property was owned free and clear, a fully paid asset transferred seamlessly to DeAndre. But Beatrice had tracked the shadow transactions. I watched as black lines began to weave around the digital representation of the estate, wrapping it in a suffocating web of illicit debt. DeAndre's gambling addiction had driven him far past the velvet ropes of high-stakes casinos. He had become deeply entangled with an underground syndicate. When his losses mounted, he had secretly leveraged the family mansion, bypassing legitimate financial institutions entirely. He had signed toxic, predatory shadow mortgages with violent, unregulated lenders. The interest rates were astronomical, engineered with compounding penalties designed to ensure the principal could never actually be repaid. I traced the digital paper trail, following the money from the underground lenders directly to offshore betting accounts. The total outstanding balance flashed on my screen in a harsh, glaring font: 20,000. The mansion was collateral for $20 million in illegal mob loans. The moment DeAndre signed the inheritance papers, he became the sole legal owner of the property, which meant he was now the sole undisputed debtor to a syndicate of ruthless predators. They did not send strongly worded letters from corporate lawyers. They did not care about credit scores. They sent enforcers. DeAndre was currently sleeping in a $15 million glass house that he did not actually own, completely oblivious to the fact that the actual owners were about to come collecting a $20 million blood debt. Beatrice had not just disinherited them. She had engineered their absolute ruin. She had used their own boundless greed as the executioner. They had fought so hard to push me out of the inner circle, viewing me as weak because I preferred quiet logic over loud performative wealth. They had frozen me out to protect their stolen crowns, never realizing the crowns were forged from toxic waste. They were dead, and they just did not know it yet. I sat back in my chair. The harsh light of the monitors illuminated the dark corners of my condo. The financial autopsy was complete. The cosmetics empire was a federal crime scene. The family mansion was mob collateral. My siblings were financially radioactive. I looked at the third and final folder resting on my desktop: the trust. My hands were perfectly steady now. The fear and panic that had plagued me for the past 48 hours were completely gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. I dragged the folder into the parsing engine. The decryption sequence required a final secure token from the titanium drive. The software verified the hardware keys and unlocked the directory. A single pristine dashboard appeared on my center monitor. There were no red lines of debt, There were no black webs of illegal loans. There was only a single brilliantly illuminated ledger detailing the clean, offshore accounts Beatrice had meticulously established over the past 3 years. The assets were perfectly diversified: high-yield municipal bonds, secure international commercial real estate holdings, and untouched liquid capital routed through anonymous banking protocols in incredibly secure jurisdictions. The master total sat at the top of the dashboard, glowing in quiet, undisputed power: $100, $1,000, $1,000. It was completely unencumbered. It was untouchable by American tax liens, shielded from probate courts, and entirely invisible to the aggressive lawyers my brother and sister currently employed. The money was clean, and I was the sole irrevocable executor and beneficiary. I turned my head and looked at the dining room table. Elias was still standing guard. The unrolled Basquiat canvas rested under the soft glow of his penlight, an explosion of raw $35 million genius. The physical deed of ownership, fully authenticated and legally binding, sat in the digital vault on my screen, right next to the offshore routing numbers. I had woken up this morning as a discarded sister, a target for extortion, facing the terrifying prospect of losing my modest home to an artificial financial freeze orchestrated by Desmond. Now I sat in the blue light of my workstation, holding a combined liquid and physical asset value of $135 million. I looked back at the screens displaying the impending doom of my siblings on the left and right, alongside my own absolute financial sovereignty in the center. I was no longer the quiet auditor fixing their broken systems from the shadows. I was the executioner. I was the architect. I was the most powerful person in this family. A slow, deliberate smile formed on my face. Desmond and Jasmine wanted to play a game of ruthless corporate warfare. They wanted to use leverage to force my submission. They had declared war without understanding the battlefield. I closed the parsing software and safely ejected the titanium drive, slipping it securely into my pocket. The data was locked. The map was drawn. It was time to let the system crash. Across the city, the illusion of ultimate power was already beginning to shatter. High above the chaotic streets of downtown, Desmond sat frozen behind his massive mahogany desk in the executive suite of the cosmetics headquarters. The panoramic view of the skyline usually fed his ego, but today the expansive glass windows only made him feel terrifyingly exposed. The climate control was set to a crisp 68 degrees, yet a thick bead of sweat rolled down the side of his neck, soaking into the collar of his bespoke Italian shirt. Jasmine paced the length of the office like a caged predator. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, echoing the frantic rhythm of Desmond's racing heart. "Transfer the funds." Jasmine snapped, pausing to glare at him. "The marketing department is threatening a walkout. Vendors are putting a hold on the new product line shipments. I need $5 million in the primary operating account by noon, or the entire supply chain collapses. Do your accounting magic and fix it." Desmond did not answer. His eyes were glued to his dual monitors. His fingers flew across the keyboard, entering administrative credentials, bypassing the standard corporate firewalls, and accessing the hidden routing software he had used for the past 5 years. He navigated to the offshore shell accounts, the secret digital vaults, where he had been siphoning the company's lifeblood. He pressed the execute key to refresh the balances, expecting to see the stolen safety net that allowed them to operate. The screen blinked, the numbers populated: 0. Desmond stared at the digital readout. His brain refused to process the data. He hit the refresh key again, his finger striking the plastic hard enough to crack it. The screen reloaded. The balances remained completely barren. There were no hidden millions. There was no safety net. The accounts had been systematically and professionally drained. Grandmother Beatrice had emptied the primary operating funds and seized the offshore accounts before transferring the company deed. She had left them a hollow shell. Jasmine demanded, her voice rising an octave. "What is going on?" Desmond opened his mouth to speak, but a sharp, aggressive beep from his secure private email server cut him off. A priority message had just bypassed his administrative filters. He clicked the icon. The digital letterhead displayed the official seal of the Internal Revenue Service. It was a formal notification of a preliminary corporate audit. The automated system had flagged massive structural anomalies in their pension fund reporting. The document demanded immediate compliance regarding a $40 million deficit in undocumented tax liabilities and embezzled funds. Federal lines were already being drafted. A sound escaped Desmond's throat, something between a gasp and a choke. He fell back into his leather chair, the blood draining completely from his face. Jasmine marched around the desk and looked at the monitors. Her eyes scanned the stark zeros on the banking screen and the devastating federal audit notice. The haughty, untouchable CEO facade dissolved in an instant. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently. "Where is the money?" Jasmine shrieked, grabbing Desmond by the shoulder and shaking him. "Where is the pension money? Where is the offshore cash? I do not know." Desmond stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "I set up the routing perfectly. No one knew the access codes. No one except Beatrice." He stopped. A memory suddenly slammed into his mind with the force of a physical blow. 2 days ago, during the reading of the will, the estate lawyer had pulled Desmond aside for a private conversation. The lawyer had mentioned a discrepancy in Beatrice's final inventory. He had casually noted that a heavily encrypted master drive, a device Beatrice allegedly used to store her most sensitive personal files and financial records, was missing from her safe. The lawyer had assumed it was lost or destroyed. Desmond stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair crashed into the window behind him. "Beatrice," he whispered, the horrifying truth finally connecting. "She knew. She copied my ledgers." "But where is the drive?" Jasmine demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. "If she had it, where did it go? She did not leave anything of value. She left the house to DeAndre. She left the company to us. The only physical item she specifically handed over before the asset lock was the painting." Desmond finished, his voice dropping to a dead hollow monotone. "That hideous, worthless painting of the yellow daisies. She bypassed the entire legal probate process just to ensure that specific piece of trash went directly to Nia." Jasmine's eyes widened in sheer terror. "I tried to buy it from her. I was at her condo yesterday. I offered her $5,000 just to get it out of her hands, and she refused. She looked at me like she knew something I did not." "Desmond, if she finds that drive, if she turns those ledgers over to the federal investigators, we are going to federal prison." "She does not have the skills to decrypt a master drive," Desmond said, desperately trying to convince himself. "But we cannot wait to find out." Desmond snatched his coat from the rack and grabbed his car keys. "Where is she right now?" he demanded. Jasmine pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she opened a tracking app she used to monitor employee travel. "She is out of town. She was assigned to an external audit in Chicago yesterday morning. Her flight does not return until Friday night. The condo is empty." "Call Tasha," Desmond ordered, his eyes dark with frantic determination. "Tell her to meet me at the parking garage in 10 minutes. We are going to that condo. We are going to rip that place apart until we find that painting, and we are going to burn that drive to ashes." The destruction mapped perfectly across my secure auditor laptop, a terrifying, beautiful web of undeniable corporate fraud. I sat in comfortable silence, miles away from the fragile glass windows of my downtown condo. The air around me was cool, sterile, and scented with ozone and polished steel. I was inside the subterranean viewing room of a private, maximum security depository located deep within the financial district. The walls were reinforced concrete. The door was a foot-thick slab of biometric locked titanium, and the privacy was absolute. Elias sat across from me at a sleek obsidian table, nursing a cup of black coffee. Resting securely between us, locked inside a heavy steel deposit box, was the rolled Basquiat canvas and Beatrice's master USB drive. I had moved the assets out of my apartment days ago. I knew my siblings. I knew their arrogance, and I knew their complete lack of boundaries. The painting I had actually left hanging on my living room wall was a $20 thrift store canvas of a dreary sailboat, an ugly piece of junk I had purchased months ago. I had attached a microscopic, battery-powered GPS tracking node to the back of the cheap wooden frame, fully expecting one of my greedy siblings to eventually try and steal it out of pure spite. To complete the illusion, I had manipulated the corporate travel portal, planting a fabricated, highly visible itinerary that placed me on a flight to Chicago for a phantom external audit. Desmond and Jasmine were remarkably predictable. They only operated on the surface level of deception, They never bothered to look at the underlying code. A sharp, rhythmic chime from my smartphone broke the quiet hum of the vault room. It was a proximity alert. I tapped the screen, bringing up a proprietary application linked to a network of high-definition motion-activated security cameras I had discreetly installed throughout my condo. One lens was hidden behind the ventilation grate of the smoke detector. Another was embedded in the spine of a fake dictionary on my bookshelf. A third was wired into the digital alarm clock on my nightstand. The interface loaded, instantly bathing my face in the stark full-color feed of my living room. The front door of my apartment swung open, violently rebounding off the drywall with a heavy thud. Desmond stormed into the frame. He looked nothing like the polished, untouchable financial mastermind he pretended to be. His bespoke Italian suit jacket was discarded. His silk tie was loosened and askew, and a thick sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution order being drafted. Right behind him, scanning the hallway before slipping inside and pulling the door shut, was Tasha. Jasmine's notoriously ruthless executive assistant had clearly abandoned her post in the getaway car drawn upstairs by Desmond's frantic energy. I watched as Desmond tore into the living room, his eyes darting wildly across the walls. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the empty space above my sofa, where the decoy painting had hung just yesterday. I had taken it down and tossed it in the dumpster behind the building on my way to the bank, leaving a conspicuous, dust-free square on the drywall. Where is it? Desmond practically screamed, his hands tearing at his hair. Where is the painting? Where did she hide the drive? Desmond. What are you doing? Tasha hissed, her voice captured with crystal clarity by the hidden microphones. You said you were grabbing a painting and a hard drive. We have been in the building for 20 minutes. The neighbors are going to call the cops. We need to leave before someone sees us. Desmond completely ignored her. The clinical, calculated approach of a corporate executive vanished, replaced entirely by the desperate panic of a trapped animal. He grabbed the cushions off my sofa and hurled them across the room. He flipped the heavy mahogany coffee table upside down, the wood crashing violently against the floorboards. He yanked the books off my shelves, sending dozens of volumes cascading to the floor, kicking them savagely aside as he searched the baseboards for hidden wall safes. I leaned closer to the screen, my thumb hovering over the interface controls. The pressure was cracking his carefully constructed facade, exposing the rotting core beneath. "It is not here!" Desmond yelled, pacing frantically across the ruined carpet, his dress shoes crunching over broken ceramics. "The drive is not here. The painting is not here. She knows, Tasha. That little auditor freak knows everything." "Knows what?" Tasha demanded, stepping back toward the door as Desmond violently swept a stack of magazines off a side table. "You are losing your mind. We need to go." "She knows I cooked the corporate books for 5 years." Desmond roared the high-definition audio, capturing every single syllable of his confession. "Beatrice copied my ledgers. She mapped the entire offshore network. Everything. The fake vendor invoices, the missing pension funds, all of it. I funneled $40 million in cash to the Caymans, Tasha. 40 million. And that drive has the routing numbers, the account passwords, the exact digital paper trail to prove it." Elias let out a low, impressed whistle from across the table. He leaned in, watching the feed over my shoulder with clinical fascination. "He is singing like a canary," Elias murmured. "You do not even have to interrogate him. He is handing you the rope." "It gets better," I replied, keeping my eyes glued to the screen. "Watch." "What are you talking about?" Tasha asked, her voice trembling now, as the reality of her own accessory liability began to set in. "You told Jasmine the money was clean. You told her the pension reallocations were legally shielded by the corporate trust." "I lied," Desmond screamed, his voice echoing loudly in the empty condo. "There is no shield. Jasmine and I just signed the inheritance deeds yesterday. We legally accepted ownership of the company. That means we legally accepted the tax liability. The IRS sent a preliminary audit notice to my secure server this morning. They are already looking. The algorithms flagged the pension deficit. If Zarya hands that drive over to the federal investigators, Jasmine and I are going to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary." I smiled, tapping the screen to ensure the video and audio were capturing and exporting to my cloud server in maximum resolution. Zarya. He finally used my name with the respect it commanded, even if it was born entirely of sheer, unadulterated terror. "We have to leave," Tasha said, her professional composure entirely shattered. "If the feds are auditing, I am not going down with you for tax fraud. We need to get out of this apartment right now." "I cannot leave without the drive," Desmond yelled, dropping to his knees and ripping open the bottom drawer of my desk, frantically tossing tax returns and utility bills into the air. "If she has it, she controls everything. She owns us. I have to find it." I watched as Tasha turned and bolted out the front door, leaving it wide open in her wake. She abandoned him without a second thought. Desmond was left completely alone in the wreckage of his own making. He scrambled to his feet and ran into my bedroom, continuing to tear my apartment apart. He was a desperate, broken man hunting for a salvation that was sitting safely in a bank vault miles away. Elias leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at the screen, then looked at me. So he said quietly, "Do I call the police? A break and destruction of property. They will catch him red-handed with his fingerprints all over your apartment." I shook my head, my eyes never leaving the high-definition feed. "No. Calling the local police for a simple breaking and entering is a complete waste of leverage. Desmond has highly paid corporate defense attorneys on retainer. If the police arrest him for trashing my condo, his lawyers will have him out on bail before midnight. They will plead it down to a misdemeanor, pay a fine for the property damage, and claim he was experiencing an acute mental health crisis due to the stress of our grandmother's passing. It would be a slap on the wrist." Elias raised an eyebrow. "You want him to get away with destroying your home?" "I want him to feel safe for just a little while longer," I explained, tapping the screen to stop the recording. I verified that the massive video file had successfully uploaded directly to my secure encrypted offshore server. If I call the police now, he goes on the immediate defensive. He invokes his right to remain silent. He starts destroying evidence at the corporate office. He starts shredding hard drives and magnetically wiping servers. I need him to think he still has a chance to fix this. I need him to return to his desk and try to cover his tracks. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating the dim vault room. The decrypted master ledger from Beatrice's titanium drive was already loaded into my forensic parsing software. The red lines of Desmond's offshore wire transfers glowed brightly against the dark background, a digital map of his greed. "A breaking and entering charge gets him probation," I told Elias, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I began compiling a new master directory on my desktop. But federal tax evasion, corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the theft of employee pension funds, those carry mandatory minimum sentences. Those are the kinds of charges that freeze your bank accounts, seize your passports, and strip you of everything you own. I dragged the newly recorded video file into the master directory, placing it right next to the damning financial ledgers. I was no longer just an auditor reviewing historical data. I was an active investigator building a bulletproof, irrefutable prosecution portfolio. Desmond had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. The financial ledgers proved the money was stolen, but highly paid white-collar defense attorneys could always argue about authorized access and administrative errors in court. They could claim Desmond was acting on Beatrice's orders, or that a rogue employee had hijacked his credentials to frame him. But high-definition audio and video of Desmond explicitly screaming his exact crimes, confirming the exact amount stolen, naming the offshore destination, and admitting his desperate attempt to destroy the evidence, that was the holy grail of financial prosecution. It was a completely unassailable confession wrapped in a bow and delivered directly to my secure server. I began structuring the portfolio with the clinical precision of a seasoned forensic accountant. I created a digital timeline matching Desmond's verbal confession in the video to the exact dates of the wire transfers in the ledger. I highlighted the precise moments he funneled the cash into the Caymans, cross-referencing his spoken words with the routing numbers Beatrice had captured. I applied cryptographic hashes to the video files to prove they had not been altered or doctored. I built an undeniable chronological narrative of systemic, calculated corporate theft. "You are building a guillotine," Elias observed, watching the portfolio take shape on my screen with a look of deep respect. "I am building a mirror." I corrected, my eyes focused intently on the data streams. "I am simply going to show the federal authorities exactly who my brother and sister really are." I finished compiling the primary dossier. It contained the decrypted corporate ledger, the offshore routing numbers, the proof of the empty pension funds, and the high-definition video confession of the break-in. I encrypted the entire package, securing it with a biometric lock, and transferred a clean executable copy to a fresh, sterile flash drive. What is the next step? Elias asked, his tone shifting from an art appraiser to an active participant in the strategy. We let them dig, I said, closing the laptop with a satisfying click. Desmond is going to go back to the office empty-handed. He is going to tell Jasmine that the drive is missing and the painting is gone. They are going to panic. They will try to initiate massive cover-up protocols, shifting money around, falsifying new documents, and trying to plug a $40 million hole before the IRS audit team arrives at their door. I stood up, picking up the sterile flash drive. Every move they make to cover up the fraud will generate a new alert in the federal banking system. They will trigger their own alarms. I am going to let them exhaust themselves trying to fix an unfixable problem. I placed the flash drive into the titanium deposit box, resting it gently next to the Basquiat canvas. And when they are completely out of options, when their lawyers are screaming, and the federal agents are walking through the marble lobby of the cosmetics headquarters, I will hand-deliver this portfolio directly to the lead investigator. I locked the deposit box, the heavy steel mechanism sliding into place with a definitive echoing thud. My siblings had spent their entire lives underestimating me, viewing my quiet nature and my love of numbers as a weakness to be exploited. They thought they were playing a Game of Thrones, fighting tooth and nail over a rotting corporate empire and a mansion drowning in mob debt. They had no idea that the game had already ended. The board was cleared. I held the keys to the future, and I was about to lock the door on their past. I checked the live feed on my phone one last time. Desmond was sitting on the floor of my ruined bedroom, staring blankly at the wall, a man who had finally realized he was trapped in a burning building with no exits. It was time to wait for the smoke to rise. I watched the screen fade to black as the motion sensor in my ruined apartment finally timed out. The digital silence in the vault was profoundly comforting. Elias packed up his appraisal gear, offering a silent nod of respect, before slipping out the heavy titanium door, leaving me alone with the final execution protocol. I needed to finalize the transmission. The master dossier was perfect. It was a self-contained, digitally signed package of absolute financial destruction. I opened a secure, heavily encrypted communications portal on my laptop. During my years grinding through corporate audits, I had cultivated a pristine reputation and a network of contacts that extended deep into federal regulatory agencies. I did not need to submit an anonymous tip to a generic hotline. I had direct lines. I addressed the primary encrypted parcel to a former colleague who now served as a senior director within the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division in Atlanta. I added a secondary recipient, a contact operating out of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Task Force. I drafted a brief, highly technical summary of the enclosed data. I detailed the $40 million pension embezzlement, the offshore routing architecture, and the precise timestamps corresponding to Desmond's recorded confession. I did not ask for an investigation. I provided a completed one. My finger hovered over the execute key for a fraction of a second. Once this data entered the federal servers, the machinery of the United States government would engage. There would be no backroom deals, no quiet settlements, and no family interventions. It would be a relentless, unyielding avalanche of subpoenas, asset seizures, and federal indictments. I pressed the key. The progress bar shot across the screen, turning solid green. The transmission was complete. The trap was locked. The federal hounds had been released, and they already had the scent. I spent the next 48 hours operating out of a luxury hotel suite paid for by the offshore trust, watching the digital ripples of my siblings' panic. The silence from my family was deafening. They did not call to check on me. They did not attempt to find me. They were entirely consumed by the rapidly deteriorating illusion of their empire. Then the digital invitation arrived. It was forwarded to my secure email by a sympathetic former colleague who had always despised Jasmine. The subject line read, "The Buckhead Dynasty Inaugural Gala." I opened the attachment and actually laughed out loud at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of it. Jasmine and DeAndre were not retreating. They were doubling down. In the face of empty corporate accounts and looming federal audits, they had decided to throw a massive $500,000 coming out party at the Four Seasons in downtown Atlanta. The invitation was a masterclass in arrogance printed on heavy digital vellum with gold foil accents. It formally announced the transition of power, crowning Jasmine as the undisputed queen of the corporate boardroom and DeAndre as the new king of the city's real estate elite. The guest list was a staggering collection of Atlanta's most powerful figures. They had invited state politicians, mega church leaders, elite venture capitalists, and the heavy hitters of the local entertainment industry. It was a desperate, transparent play. Jasmine was clearly hoping that projecting an image of absolute unshakable wealth would attract a sudden influx of naive investor capital, a desperate attempt to plug the $40 million hole before the system collapsed. DeAndre was undoubtedly using the lavish spectacle to signal his untouchable status to the violent loan sharks, holding his shadow, mortgages, faking liquidity to buy himself a few more weeks of breathing room. Desmond must have been dying inside, forced to wear a tuxedo and smile for the cameras while knowing the federal hammer was already swinging down toward his neck. They were throwing a celebration on the deck of a sinking ship, completely oblivious to the fact that the lifeboats had already been sold. I stared at the gleaming invitation on my screen. They wanted an audience. They wanted a coronation. I decided it was only right that the architect of their destruction attend the ceremony. But the woman who walked into the Four Seasons ballroom could not be the quiet, invisible auditor they had spent their entire lives walking all over. That woman was dead. I closed my laptop, grabbed my coat, and left the hotel suite. It was time to dress for the occasion. I directed my private driver to a highly exclusive appointment-only haute couture boutique in the wealthiest sector of Buckhead. For years, my wardrobe had consisted of conservative gray and navy pantsuits. They were professional armor designed to make me blend into the background, to make me invisible, while I untangled other people's financial messes. I walked into the boutique and requested a private fitting room. I told the senior stylist exactly what I needed. I did not want understated elegance. I wanted a weapon. Hours later, I stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling three-way mirror. The transformation was breathtaking. The conservative auditor was completely gone, replaced by a woman radiating absolute unapologetic power. I wore a custom-fitted emerald green silk gown. The color was rich and saturated, a striking, vibrant homage to the color of money and the venom of envy. The cut was architectural and sharp, featuring a plunging neckline and a dramatic sweeping train that demanded space and attention. It was not a dress designed for blending in. It was a dress designed for conquering. I paired the gown with a set of diamond and platinum earrings purchased directly from the offshore trust's liquidity, their icy brilliance catching the light with every movement. My hair was styled in sleek cascading waves, and my makeup was immaculate, featuring a sharp crimson lip that contrasted perfectly with the emerald silk. I looked like a woman who could buy and sell everyone in the room. Because as of yesterday, I actually could. With the visual transformation complete, I turned my attention to the tactical logistics. A stunning dress was a powerful opening move, but I was preparing for a war, and wars required a ruthless infantry. I called Elias. I needed him to attend the gala as my personal escort. I needed his calm, distinguished presence, but more importantly, I needed his professional credentials. He was bringing the fully authenticated, legally binding provenance documents for the Basquiat canvas. When Jasmine and DeAndre inevitably tried to dismiss me as a bitter, penniless outcast, Elias would drop the paperwork proving I held a $35 million liquid asset in my back pocket. Next, I utilized the immense resources of my offshore trust to assemble a strike team. I did not hire standard family lawyers. I retained the services of a boutique, high-powered corporate litigation firm known for completely dismantling hostile takeovers. I hired 3 senior partners, men and women, who billed at $1,000 an hour and possessed the legal instincts of great white sharks. I held a strategic briefing with my newly acquired legal team in the private boardroom of my hotel. I laid out the exact parameters of the evening. I provided them with summary briefs of the federal tax fraud, the empty pension funds, and the illegal shadow mortgages currently choking the Buckhead mansion. I gave them the exact timeline of the IRS and FBI transmissions, They are going to try to have me forcibly removed from the property the moment they see me. I told the lead litigator, a sharp-featured woman named Vance, who looked like she enjoyed destroying corrupt executives for sport. They will claim I am trespassing. They will threaten to call security. Vance smiled, a predatory gleam in her eyes. Let them try, Ms. Wilson. We have drafted preemptive cease and desist orders, emergency injunctions against any corporate restructuring, and formal notices of severe fiduciary breach. The moment they raise their voices, we will serve them with enough legal paperwork to bury their entire executive board. They will not be able to take a breath without violating a federal statute. Excellent, I replied, smoothing the fabric of my emerald gown. We reviewed the floor plan of the Four Seasons ballroom, mapping out the entrance, the VIP sections, and the main stage where Jasmine and DeAndre were scheduled to give their joint keynote address. We synchronized our watches. Elias would arrive with me, flanking my right side, carrying the art documentation in a sleek leather briefcase. The three litigators would fan out, cutting off any escape routes and neutralizing any attempts by Desmond to deploy corporate security. We were not just going to crash the party. We were going to orchestrate a highly visible, legally devastating hostile takeover right in the middle of their crowning moment. I looked at my reflection in the boardroom window. The emerald silk shimmered in the ambient light. The quiet, compliant sister who had absorbed their insults, fixed their mistakes, and surrendered her salary to protect their image was gone forever. Grandmother Beatrice had seen the ruthless potential buried deep inside me, and she had provided the exact tools necessary to carve it out. I checked my phone. The FBI contact had securely confirmed receipt of the master dossier. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had officially escalated the preliminary audit to an active Tier 1 federal investigation. The trap was no longer just set. The jaws were already snapping shut. It is time, I announced, turning to Elias and my team of litigators. We descended to the underground parking garage where a convoy of black armored executive vehicles waited with engines idling. I slid into the back of the lead car, the plush leather interior cool and quiet. The driver merged seamlessly into the heavy Atlanta traffic, heading directly for the glowing skyline of downtown. Jasmine and DeAndre had invited the entire city to witness their ascension to the throne. They had spared no expense to build a monument to their own vanity. They thought tonight would be the ultimate validation of their greed. I stared out the tinted window as the towering glass facade of the Four Seasons Hotel came into view. The valet lane was jammed with luxury sports cars and eager photographers. It was a beautiful night for a slaughter. Inside the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons, the air was thick with the scent of imported white orchids and the intoxicating, suffocating aroma of unchecked arrogance. Jasmine and DeAndre had spared absolutely no expense to transform the elegant corporate space into a gaudy, glittering monument to their own fabricated success. Massive, 10-foot-high ice sculptures carved into the shape of the cosmetics company logo dominated the four corners of the sprawling room, slowly weeping freezing water into illuminated silver basins. Waitstaff in crisp white tuxedos and black silk bow ties circulated tirelessly through the dense, glittering crowd, balancing heavy silver trays loaded with beluga caviar, gold leaf-dusted truffles, and imported oysters. The guest list was a meticulously curated roster of Atlanta's absolute highest society. I saw state senators shaking hands with megachurch pastors, while elite venture capitalists mingled comfortably with local entertainment royalty. Everyone in the room was eager to kiss the rings of the newly crowned corporate monarchs, completely oblivious to the fact that the royal treasury was a barren wasteland. DeAndre was holding court at a roped-off elevated VIP booth right next to the main stage, demanding the attention of everyone within a 50-foot radius. He wore a custom-tailored burgundy velvet tuxedo jacket and a diamond-encrusted watch that likely cost more than a starter home. He was laughing loudly, throwing his head back as he popped the cork on a massive, gold-plated bottle of Armand de Brignac. He poured the $5,000 vintage carelessly into a towering pyramid of crystal flutes, intentionally letting the expensive champagne spill over the edges to demonstrate his boundless wealth. He basked in the sycophantic cheers of his hangers, on looking entirely convinced of his own invincibility. He was a man deeply in debt to violent predators, yet he stood there celebrating, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was already crumbling into dust. At the center of the room, the crystal chandeliers dimmed, and a solitary, brilliant white spotlight illuminated the main stage. Jasmine stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. She wore a blindingly expensive, heavily beaded silver gown that caught every flash of the photographer's cameras, making her look like a shimmering illusion. She gripped the edges of the podium, projecting an aura of solemn dignity and regal grace that I knew was entirely manufactured. She tapped the microphone, the sharp percussive sound echoing across the cavernous ballroom. The lively chatter of the elite crowd slowly died down, replaced by a respectful, attentive silence. "Thank you," Jasmine began, her voice carrying a perfectly practiced tremor of deep emotion. "Thank you all for joining us tonight as we inaugurate a brilliant new era for our family and our beloved company. As many of you know, we recently lost our grandmother, the great Beatrice. She was a titan of industry, she was a visionary, but more importantly, she was the loving matriarch of our family." Jasmine paused, raising a manicured hand to wipe away a completely non-existent tear from the corner of her eye. The crowd murmured in collective, genuine sympathy, utterly fooled by her theatrical performance. Beatrice entrusted Desmond and me with the heavy responsibility of carrying her legacy forward. Jasmine continued, her voice gaining a triumphant, forceful edge. She knew that the future of this empire required bold, unyielding leadership. She knew it required vision. And she knew that DeAndre and I were the only ones capable of elevating this brand to unprecedented global heights. Tonight is not just a celebration of corporate wealth. It is a celebration of our destiny. It was the perfect cue. I did not bother waiting for an invitation. I nodded to Vance, my lead litigator. She stepped forward and pushed the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom with absolute, unrelenting force. The doors swung open, violently crashing against the interior walls with a sound like a thunderclap. The sharp, percussive bang echoed through the cavernous space, instantly shattering the polite applause that had just begun to ripple through the audience. Every single head in the ballroom turned simultaneously. The string quartet, playing softly on the mezzanine balcony, abruptly stopped their bows, freezing awkwardly over their instruments. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. The massive room fell dead silent. I stepped through the doorway and into the light. The emerald green silk of my haute couture gown flowed around me like liquid glass. The diamonds at my ears and throat caught the harsh glare of the chandeliers, fracturing the light into brilliant icy shards. I did not look down. I did not shrink away. I held my head high, projecting the absolute, unshakable sovereignty of a woman who held their entire world in the palm of her hand. Elias flanked my right side, looking like a distinguished statesman in his sharply tailored charcoal suit, his hand gripping the sleek leather briefcase containing the undeniable proof of my offshore wealth and the Basquiat provenance. To my left and slightly behind me walked Vance and her two senior partners. They moved with the synchronized, predatory grace of a highly trained military strike team. They were dressed in severe, impeccable black suits, their faces arranged in masks of cold, clinical detachment. They radiated pure intimidation. We moved forward. The sea of politicians, investors, and socialites parted instantly, scrambling backward to clear a wide, unobstructed path down the center of the ballroom. I walked with slow, deliberate precision. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels on the polished marble floor was the only sound in the suffocating silence. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, staring directly at the stage. I saw DeAndre lower his bottle of champagne, his jaw going slack as the confident smirk slid completely off his face. I saw Desmond standing near the edge of the stage, hiding in the shadows. His face drained of all color until he looked like a reanimated corpse. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew I had survived the break-in, and he knew I held the detonator. Before I reached the halfway point of the room, Tasha detached herself from the shadows near the VIP section. Jasmine's ruthless executive assistant was clearly operating on instinct, desperate to protect her boss's crowning moment. She marched aggressively toward me, signaling frantically to two massive, broad-shouldered security guards stationed near the exit doors. "You need to leave immediately," Tasha hissed, stepping directly into my path with her arms crossed, trying to block my progression. "You are not on the guest list, Zarya," Turn around right now before I have security drag you out the back door and throw you in the street. I did not even break my stride. I simply kept walking. Vance smoothly detached herself from our formation and stepped directly between Tasha and me. The litigator did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She simply reached into the inner pocket of her tailored blazer and produced a thick, neatly bound stack of legal documents. She slapped the heavy paperwork flat against Tasha's chest with enough force to make the assistant stumble backward. That is a formal notice of severe fiduciary breach, a preemptive injunction against any corporate restructuring, and a federal preservation order regarding all corporate assets, Vance stated, her voice carrying the icy authority of a seasoned courtroom killer. If your security personnel touch my client, or if you attempt to impede her movement in any way, I will personally see to it that you are named as a co-conspirator in the impending federal indictments. Stand down. Tasha looked down at the legal documents, then looked up at the cold, predatory expressions on the faces of the three litigators. The color drained rapidly from her cheeks. She took a slow, trembling step backward, raising her hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. The two security guards, seeing the executive assistant immediately back down wisely, decided to stay exactly where they were. I bypassed Tasha without giving her a second glance and marched directly to the foot of the main stage. Jasmine was staring down at me, her chest heaving underneath the heavy silver beading of her gown. The initial shock of my dramatic entrance was rapidly burning away, replaced by a toxic, blinding fury. She had spent a fortune to engineer this moment of supreme public validation, and she was absolutely livid that I was stealing the spotlight. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the edges of the acrylic podium. She grabbed the microphone, ripping it from the stand, and leaned forward. She decided to go on the offensive. She decided to publicly execute me. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we have an uninvited guest, Jasmine sneered into the microphone. Her voice echoed harshly through the silent ballroom, dripping with condescension and venom. Everyone, please give a warm, sympathetic welcome to my estranged sister Zarya. The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably in their formal wear as the ugly family drama spilled out into the open. Jasmine paced to the edge of the stage, looking down at me with absolute disgust. I suppose I should not be surprised that you crashed this gala. Jasmine continued, her voice rising in volume, desperate to maintain her narrative of superiority. You always were the bitter, jealous outcast of this family. You could never handle the pressure of the corporate world. You dropped out. You ran away to play with your little spreadsheets while DeAndre and I did the real work. And now that grandmother Beatrice realized exactly how useless you are and rightfully cut you out of the inheritance, here you are. DeAndre let out a loud, mocking laugh from the VIP booth. He raised his crystal flute of champagne, pointing it at me in a gesture of supreme arrogance. Let security throw the broke dropout out on the street, Jasmine. DeAndre yelled, his voice carrying clearly over the silent crowd. We do not have time for beggars tonight. Jasmine smiled, emboldened by her brother's crude support. You see, Zarya, you do not belong here, she spat into the microphone, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. You are wearing a rented dress, trying to pretend you are something you are not. You came here begging for a handout because you have nothing. You are a failure. You are a complete embarrassment to the Beatrice legacy. You have no money, no power, and absolutely no place in this family. Get out of my ballroom. The entire room held its collective breath. Elite investors and politicians watched with wide eyes, fully expecting me to crumble. They expected me to burst into tears, turn around and run out the mahogany doors in absolute humiliating defeat. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I simply smiled. It was not a defensive smile. It was a cold, radiant, terrifying expression of absolute victory. I lifted the hem of my emerald gown and gracefully climbed the 3 carpeted steps onto the main stage. Jasmine froze. The sheer confidence in my movement completely derailed her aggressive momentum. She instinctively took a step backward as I approached, her eyes darting nervously toward Desmond, who was standing frozen in the wings, looking like a man awaiting the hangman. I walked directly up to Jasmine. I stood inches from her face, letting her see the icy, unshakable certainty in my eyes. I reached out smoothly, my hand closing over the polished metal of the microphone. Jasmine's hand was trembling violently. Her grip was weak, paralyzed by sudden, inexplicable fear. I forcefully pulled the microphone directly from her shaking fingers. The sharp squeal of audio feedback pierced the dead silence of the ballroom as I wrested the microphone from Jasmine. She stumbled backward, her silver heels catching on the carpeted stage, looking completely helpless. I adjusted my grip on the sleek metal cylinder, staring out at the sea of terrified, captivated faces. "Thank you for that colorful introduction, Jasmine," I said, my voice smooth, amplified, and echoing with absolute authority. "But since we are airing family grievances in front of Atlanta's most elite investors, I believe it is only fair that we deal in facts, rather than your desperate fiction. You claim I am a penniless failure begging for a handout. Let us address that first." I turned slightly and gestured to Elias. He moved to the center of the stage with the practiced, dignified grace of a man who dealt exclusively in priceless antiquities. He set his leather briefcase on the acrylic podium, popping the brass locks. The sharp clicks echoed through the room. Elias withdrew a thick stack of archival watermarked documents, bearing the seals of the world's most prestigious auction houses and authentication boards. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the cluster of high society art collectors seated in the front row. "Good evening," Elias said, his refined academic tones slicing through the tension. "My name is Elias Thorne, Senior Appraiser and Authenticator. I have been retained by Ms. Zaria to publicly verify the primary asset of her recent inheritance, the painting Grandmother Beatrice left to her granddaughter, which the current corporate leadership casually dismissed as thrift store trash, is no such thing." Elias held up the primary certificate of authenticity, turning it slowly so the photographers in the press pit could capture the embossed seals. "It is a fully authenticated, undocumented masterpiece by Jean-Michel Basquiat," Elias announced, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "It was acquired privately in the 1980s and kept in pristine climate-controlled secrecy. Based on recent market comparables and private auction data, I have officially appraised this canvas at a highly conservative floor value of $35 million. A collective physical gasp ripped through the ballroom. The elite art collectors in the front row began whispering frantically to one another, their eyes wide with shock and immediate greed. $35 million in clean, highly liquid, untaxed capital. Elias finished snapping his briefcase shut and stepping back to my side. I looked at Jasmine. Her jaw hung slack. The blood had drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale beneath her heavy makeup. DeAndre stood frozen in the VIP booth. The $5,000 bottle of champagne slipped from his numb fingers, crashing onto the marble floor and sending a spray of expensive foam and shattered green glass across his polished shoes. They had mocked me. They had literally handed me the greatest single asset in Beatrice's entire empire because they were too arrogant to look past the ugly wooden frame. In a matter of seconds, I had just proven that I was exponentially wealthier than everyone standing in this room. But I am not here to boast about my sudden windfall. I continued, my voice dropping to a colder, more dangerous register. I am here to publicly congratulate my brother and sister on their coronation. You see, yesterday afternoon, Jasmine and DeAndre eagerly signed the inheritance deeds, legally seizing total control of the cosmetics company and the family estate. Let us take a look at exactly what they inherited. I turned my head and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the AV booth located on the mezzanine level. My offshore trust had easily outbid whatever Jasmine was paying the technical crew. Instantly, the massive high-definition LED screens flanking the stage flickered. The glamorous, soft-focus slideshow of Jasmine and DeAndre posing in designer clothes vanished. In its place, stark, undeniable forensic audit spreadsheets illuminated the ballroom in blinding white and violent red. Federal seal watermarks dominated the background of the slides. Bank routing numbers, deficit tallies, and offshore transfer logs scrolled across the screens in massive, inescapable fonts. "By signing those inheritance deeds, you did not just inherit a brand, Jasmine," I said, pacing slowly across the stage, forcing her to shrink back from my proximity. "You legally assumed total unmitigated liability for every single fraudulent transaction this company has executed over the past 5 years. You inherited a hollow, rotting shell." I gestured to the screen on the left. The crowd of investors, politicians, and megachurch leaders turned their heads, their expressions morphing from confusion to sheer horror. As my forensic audit clearly displays, the The primary corporate operating accounts are completely empty, I announced, projecting my voice over the rising murmur of panic in the room. The employee pension funds have been systematically drained. Furthermore, the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division, officially launched a Tier 1 investigation this morning regarding a $40 million deficit in undocumented tax liabilities. Those liens are now legally attached to your names. I turned my attention to the VIP booth, locking eyes with my older brother. DeAndre looked like he was going to vomit. He gripped the velvet ropes of his enclosure, his chest heaving. "And DeAndre," I called out, ensuring the spotlight tracked my gaze to illuminate his absolute terror. "Your beautiful Buckhead mansion is not the fortress you claim it is. The deeds you signed yesterday transferred ownership of a property, leveraged to the absolute breaking point. I have tracked the shadow mortgages. You owe $20 million to unlicensed, unregulated lenders. You owe the mob, DeAndre. And according to these ledgers, your first balloon payment is due in less than 48 hours. The ballroom erupted into chaos. The politicians in the front rows physically backed away from the stage, terrified of being photographed anywhere near the epicenter of a massive federal fraud scandal. The venture capitalists, who had been mingling and sipping champagne just moments ago, suddenly looked furious. They had been invited to invest in a gold mine, only to discover they were standing on a ticking landmine. "It is a lie," a voice shrieked from the side of the stage. Desmond burst from the shadows, sprinting toward the AV control cables snaking along the edge of the platform. He was completely unhinged. His tuxedo jacket was torn, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was sweating profusely. He tripped over a heavy power cord, scrambling on his hands and knees, as he frantically tried to yank the thick black cables from their sockets, desperate to plunge the screens into darkness. "Do not listen to her!" Desmond screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria as he looked out at the furious crowd. "She is a hacker. She fabricated these numbers. The company is completely solvent. The money is there. She is just trying to destroy us, because she is bitter." Vance, my lead litigator, stepped forward to intercept him, but I held up a hand signaling her to stand down. I wanted Desmond exactly where he was. I wanted the crowd to see his pathetic, desperate flailing. "I did not fabricate a single digit, Desmond," I said, my voice echoing with chilling, remorseless calm. "I did not have to. You gave me everything I needed." I looked up at the AV booth and gave one final decisive signal. The spreadsheets on the massive screens vanished. They were instantly replaced by the crystal-clear, high-definition hidden camera footage from my apartment. The video feed was massive, stretching 20 feet across the ballroom walls. The pristine audio, blasted through the Four Seasons, state-of-the-art, surround sound system, drowning out Desmond's pathetic protests. The entire ballroom watched in stunned, breathless silence as the 50-foot-tall digital version of Desmond tore my condo apart. They watched him hurl furniture, smash glass, and rip apart my files like a deranged lunatic. And then, his own voice thundered from the speakers, echoing off the crystal chandeliers with devastating clarity. "She knows I cooked the corporate books for 5 years, the digital Desmond roared from the screens. "Beatrice copied my ledgers. She mapped the entire offshore network. Everything. The fake vendor invoices, the missing pension funds, all of it. I funneled $40 million in cash to the Caymans, Tasha. 40 million. A collective, horrifying gasp ripped through the crowd. It was the sound of 100 wealthy, powerful people simultaneously realizing they were standing in the middle of a federal crime scene. The video continued to play, Desmond explicitly outlining his own tax fraud, his embezzlement, and his terror of federal prison. The confession was absolute. It was unassailable. There was no spin, no public relations maneuver, and no legal loophole that could possibly save them from their own recorded words. I stood at the center of the stage, watching the absolute destruction of my siblings' empire unfold in real time. In the crowd, the reaction was instantaneous and violently swift. The polite veneer of high society completely shattered. Mega-church leaders turned their backs and sprinted for the exit doors, desperate to avoid the inevitable media fallout. Elite venture capitalists and angel investors, immediately whipped out their smartphones, their thumbs flying frantically across their screens as they called their wealth managers, screaming orders to freeze accounts, halt pending transfers, and sever any and all financial ties to the Beatrice brand. The wealthy elite were abandoning ship, fleeing from Jasmine, DeAndre, and Desmond as if they were infected with a lethal virus. Jasmine sank to her knees on the stage, the heavy silver beads of her gown pooling around her like broken glass. She stared out at the stampeding crowd, her hands covering her face as she let out a long, ragged wail of pure despair. DeAndre remained frozen in his VIP booth, completely paralyzed by the realization that the violent men who held his shadow mortgages were undoubtedly watching this exact footage on the evening news. Desmond lay curled on the stage floor, weeping openly, his hands covering his ears as his own voice continued to broadcast his crimes to the world. I lowered the microphone. I did not need it anymore. I turned my back on my weeping sister, my paralyzed brother, and the shattered remains of their fraudulent dynasty. Elias offered his arm and I took it, walking gracefully down the stage steps in my emerald gown, flanked by my team of invincible lawyers. We walked straight through the center of the chaotic, panicking ballroom, leaving the ashes of their empire far behind us. As my hand reached toward the heavy brass handles of the mahogany exit doors, they violently exploded inward. I stepped back smoothly, allowing the tactical vanguard to breach the perimeter. 24 federal agents poured into the glittering ballroom. The sharp, unmistakable block letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division were emblazoned across the backs of their dark tactical windbreakers. The aesthetic clash was incredibly jarring. Armed federal authorities storming a room dripping in imported orchids, weeping ice sculptures, and the suffocating scent of expensive perfume. The lead investigator, a tall, imposing man whom I had securely communicated with hours earlier, stepped through the threshold. He briefly locked eyes with me, giving a sharp, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention to the stage. "Shut it down," the investigator ordered, his voice cutting through the rising panic of the crowd. "Secure the exits. Nobody leaves until we clear the principal targets." The agents moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. They marched straight down the center aisle, their heavy boots trampling over the dropped crystal champagne flutes and scattered rose petals. Desmond did not even try to run. He lacked the spine for a physical confrontation. He lay curled in a pathetic ball on the carpeted stage, his face buried in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Two heavily armored agents hauled him to his feet by the lapels of his ruined bespoke tuxedo. The harsh metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the room as his wrists were locked tightly behind his back. He offered zero resistance, his body completely limp as they read him his rights regarding federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Jasmine was next. She had managed to push herself up from the floor, her eyes darting frantically around the room for an escape route that did not exist. An agent grabbed her firmly by the arm, dragging her away from the acrylic podium. Her heavy beaded silver gown caught on the sharp edge of the stage equipment, the delicate silk ripping audibly as they forced her hands into cuffs. The illusion of the untouchable corporate queen was entirely shattered. She thrashed against the agents, her diamond earrings swinging wildly, but she was easily overpowered. She looked small, terrified, and utterly defeated in her torn haute couture. Up in the elevated VIP booth, DeAndre was completely ignored by the initial wave of arresting agents. His punishment was entirely digital, and it was far more lethal. I watched from the floor as he stared down at his vibrating smartphone. The bright screen illuminated his sweat-drenched face in the dim lighting of the booth. It was an automated, priority notification from his shadow lenders and the primary holding bank. The alert confirmed that the sprawling Buckhead mansion had been officially seized. The assets were frozen, the digital locks had been overridden, and the property was repossessed. The $20 million mob debt had just come due, and his fabricated liquidity was gone. The heavy, gold-plated champagne bottle he had been parading around rolled forgotten across the floor, spilling expensive vintage over the edge of the booth. DeAndre dropped his phone, sinking to his knees in the spilled wine. He was a king without a castle, fully aware that federal prison was likely the only place that could keep him safe from the violent creditors he had defrauded. The agents began to parade my siblings down the center aisle, marching them right past the spot where I stood flanked by my impenetrable legal team. Tasha, who had been desperately trying to blend into a group of terrified mega-church leaders near the exit doors, was intercepted by a federal investigator. The executive assistant realized instantly that her complicity was fully documented on my servers. Seeing me standing calmly near the exit, Tasha broke away from the agent's grip and threw herself toward my feet, her professional composure replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. "Zaria, please," Tasha begged, her voice shrill and echoing off the marble pillars. "Tell them I was just an employee. Tell them I was just following Jasmine's orders. I did not know about the Cayman accounts. I can testify against them. I can give you password schedules, whatever you want. Please, you have to help me. I am not going to federal prison for them." Jasmine dug her high heels into the marble floor, forcing the agents escorting her to a halt just inches from me. Hearing her assistant immediately offer to flip on her caused a fresh wave of horror to wash over her face. But the venom and condescension that had defined Jasmine's entire existence were completely gone. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her expensive hair extensions tangled and ruined from her struggle. "Zaria," Jasmine sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine as she strained against the handcuffs. "You cannot let them do this to us. You have the money. Elias just said you have $35 million. You have those high-powered lawyers standing right next to you. Pay the bail. Fix the ledgers. Make this go away. We are your family. We are your blood. You have to help us. Blood is thicker than water. Please, Zaria, you cannot just walk away from us." I looked down at my older sister. I did not feel a single ounce of anger, and I certainly did not feel any pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the cool, clinical detachment of a senior auditor, permanently closing a highly fraudulent, toxic account. I stepped closer, the emerald green silk of my gown pooling around my feet, ensuring she could see the absolute icy resolve burning in my eyes. "Blood is just biology," I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the ballroom like a surgical scalpel. "You never treated me like family. You treated me like a dumpster for your failures. You used me to clean up your endless financial messes, absorb your constant insults, and blindly finance your pathetic delusions of grandeur. You thought you were untouchable because you were loud. But Grandma Beatrice saw exactly who you were. She gave you exactly what you deserved, a perfect rotting shell. Enjoy the audit." I turned my back on them. I did not watch as the federal agents forcefully dragged Jasmine and Desmond through the heavy doors, their wails of absolute despair fading into the distance. I pushed through the remaining crowd of stunned, silent elites who were still frantically trying to contact their wealth managers. I stepped out of the Four Seasons and into the warm, humid Atlanta night. The heavy, oppressive air of the gala was instantly replaced by the crisp, intoxicating breeze of total freedom. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the busy downtown street, painting the surrounding buildings in chaotic colors. But I walked past the entire spectacle without giving it a second glance. Elias and the corporate litigators offered a final, deeply respectful nod before dispersing into the night, their jobs perfectly executed. I climbed into the back of my waiting executive car, the plush leather seats cool and welcoming. The engine purred to life, and we pulled away from the curb, leaving the chaos, the fraud, and my toxic bloodline entirely behind me. The weeks and months that followed were a masterclass in strategic, silent execution. I did not just hoard the immense wealth Beatrice had left me. I weaponized it to build an empire of my own design. A fast-forward montage of my new reality began to play out across the city. The $35 million Basquiat canvas was securely transported under heavy guard and sold through a private, highly anonymous international auction house. The funds were immediately funneled into my pristine offshore trust. Combined with the clean capital Beatrice had meticulously hidden, my total liquid net worth quickly eclipsed $100 million. I did not buy a mega yacht. I did not buy a fleet of sports cars. I purchased a sprawling, historic brick campus situated in the heart of Atlanta. I hired the best contractors in the state, completely renovating the classic architecture and transforming the grounds into a state-of-the-art educational facility. I stood in the sunlit courtyard, a genuine smile on my face, watching as the newly forged bronze letters were securely mounted above the towering main entrance. The Beatrice Academy for Young Women. I utilized the massive trust to open an elite, fully funded academy specifically designed for young Black women, creating a sanctuary where they would never be underestimated, overlooked, or forced to shrink themselves to make others comfortable. The curriculum was a rigorous, dual-focused hybrid of my passions and Beatrice's legacy. One wing of the academy was dedicated entirely to high-level financial literacy, forensic accounting, wealth management, and corporate investment strategies. The other wing was a sprawling, beautifully lit, glass-enclosed conservatory for the fine arts, painting, archival curation, and global art history. The polished hallways were soon filled with brilliant, driven young girls wearing sharp, customized blazers. They walked the campus carrying heavy canvases and financial calculators, learning to ruthlessly audit corporate ledgers with the exact same precision they used to evaluate brushstrokes. They were being trained to conquer high-rise boardrooms and elite auction houses alike. They were armed with the unshakable knowledge that their brilliant minds and their boundless creativity were their greatest assets. They would never be treated as the background characters or the cleanup crew in someone else's story. They were being built to lead. I walked through the grand atrium of the academy, the bright morning sunlight streaming through the massive glass skylights, illuminating the vibrant original artwork hanging on the crisp white walls. The legacy Beatrice had actually wanted to leave behind was finally alive, thriving, and completely untouchable. I stopped in the center of the atrium, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored emerald suit. I looked directly into the camera lens, breaking the invisible barrier with a confident, knowing smile spreading across my face. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family just because you chose to build in silence? Let me know your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And always remember, the loudest people in the room are usually the ones with the most to hide.